She presents to the Royal Commission this piece of legislation, basically a draft act or a draft bill of a marine park that could protect or manage the GBR and still allow some exploitation, say through fisheries and tourism or whatever. It didn't necessarily rule out oil exploitation, but it basically said if it competes with other values, then it can't occur.
Yeah, okay. G'day and welcome to the Reef in Focus podcast. My name's Lincoln Bertoli and we're coming to you as always from beautiful Woolgaroo Gabar and neighbouring Bindal country here in sunny North Queensland. We're going to kick off this episode by celebrating a birthday of sorts. This month marks 50 years since the creation of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and I guess it's almost unfathomable to start with that the Great Barrier Reef that we know today could have looked very, very different. It wasn't that long ago that there were proposals to drill for oil and gas up and down the Queensland coastline and harvest coral for calcium and limestone for farming operations. And this very much led to the creation of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. And we're lucky enough today to be joined by the man who literally wrote the book on how the marine park was formed, if you haven't read it yet, Saving the Reef by Dr Rohan Lloyd, available at all good bookstores. And I'm happy to say Rohan's in the hot seat today. G'day, mate.
Hey, how you going?
Very well, thank you. Look, as we mentioned, there's plenty of stuff to dig into, and it's quite a fascinating story around the formation of the Marine Park. But can we just start with, writing the book? A project like that doesn't just happen, and being a Great Barrier Reef historian is quite a niche profession. So can you tell us, to begin with, how did your affinity with the Great Barrier Reef start?
I grew up in Townsville in North Queensland. I guess I've always looked out towards the ocean, and growing up around this area, you often take family vacations to reef spots. For me, though, the reef spots that I would visit as a kid with my family are places like Magnetic Island or coastal camping grounds around Mission Beach. So I always was pretty interested in that, in the reef as a place of adventure. But as you get older, you realise that, adventure costs money, and it's not the most accessible park in the world. I was lucky enough to have some friends when I was going through high school that had boats. They'd take me on camping trips to different islands, sailing around, like the Whitsundays or around Hinchinbrook and things like that. And I guess the more I saw, the more I sort of grew to admire the place. But I never really saw myself as being a reef historian. As you say, it's pretty niche. Wouldn't have even thought that was something that I could do. But as I progressed in my studies, I started to take a real interest in this place, the Barrier Reef, and I was particularly interested in the politics of it. About when I was doing my postgraduate studies, was studying history at the time. I was always interested in environmental history in particular, and I had a great supervisor that suggested that this would be something that you could pursue as a PhD project. And I thought, well, what's the history of the conservation of this place? Yep. How long have we been interested in it? Have we exploited it to a particular degree? And that really just set me on a completely different trajectory.
Yeah. And as you said, it is I guess a niche profession, but the theme is very much the same. A lot of people who perhaps first laid eyes on the reef, it's really influenced the direction of their career, and you're obviously no different.
Yeah, 100%. And what's interesting too, I wouldn't be much of a barrier reef historian if I, didn't see it more, if I didn't get out there into the field, so to speak. I mean, my field is really libraries and archives. So when people ask me about, oh, you must be able to get out to the reef a lot, I say, well, no. That's marine biologists, marine oceanographers. They get out onto the reef. I go to archives in Canberra and Brisbane and the ones at JCU. I don't really get to go out there for work. So for me, going out to the reef, it's still really about leisure and fun and things like that. So,
yeah, right.
But I definitely picked that up a lot more. I thought I wouldn't be worth much salt if I didn't actually know the place that I've been studying for the last 10 years.
Saying that, looking at the historical aspect of it, it's probably perhaps not so much here in North Queensland, but across maybe wider Australia. We've had some significant environmental crusades or wins, if you like, in Australia, things like the Franklin River in Tasmania, but the story of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is probably not that well known in your experience. Yeah,
I suppose so. I mean, I think things like the Franklin River, that's associated with a much larger moment within Australian environmental politics. But the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, I speak to people who were around at that time, and they can definitely remember it because it has so much ephemera associated with it. They were the things that they saw at the time. So they would see things like the bumper stickers, and sometimes there'd be posters or signs, and it was definitely in the media as well. But you are right. I do think that there's this tendency within history, particularly in the history of the environment, for people to forget this relationship that we've had with certain environments over time.
Yeah.
It is disappointing that we forget this particular, I would call it like a bit of a rupture moment, because it is so significant to not just the Barrier Reef itself, but to Australian environment, the Australian environment more broadly, I'd say.
Yeah, and we mentioned it briefly at the start of our chat, but can we dig in a little bit deeper to how the initial movement started? I guess, as we mentioned, it's almost unfathomable to think that the reef was once looked at as a viable source of minerals and things like that. So can you tell us, to begin with, what was happening when people first started pushing to protect the reef? How did that movement initially get started?
Yeah, I guess this is one of the most interesting things about the reef's history of conservation from my point of view, is that almost immediately, when I talk about the reef, I tend to talk about the settler perspective talking about non-Indigenous perspectives. There's this tendency to think that they saw it as something that could be feared, but quite quickly it turned into something that they could admire as well, and that they could see as being something that would be useful to them in all sorts of ways. So it could be a source of economic product. It could protect ships. But it could also be useful from a sort of intellectual curiosity way. So almost immediately people started to see that there's something on this reef, something about the Great Barrier Reef that is interesting, that we want to hold on to. All right? They didn't use the word conserve or protect, but you could see it in their writing, the way they would talk about it. And I'm talking about people who were writing about it in the early 19th century.
Yep.
After the establishment of Queensland as a colony, you start to see people seeking to protect particular elements of it. So, for example, the Beche de Mer and pearl shell fisheries that existed right up into the Torres Strait. They were one of the early sort of economic products. You mentioned limestone and petroleum, but one of the earliest products that people started to draw from the Barrier Reef was things like fisheries, So, and the biggest ones were the pearl shell and the Beche de Mer. So that was really associated with the GBR. In lots of different ways, tourist pamphlets, promotional material to governments, all sorts of stuff. It was the pearl shell Beche de Mer that was like the economic product of the reef.
Yep.
And you could see quite clearly the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century that those fisheries were heading towards a collapse. And so there were lots of attempts there to protect those industries. And the way that they would speak about that is about protecting the GBR as well. So these are industries of the GBR. So by protecting these fisheries, we're protecting the GBR.
Yep.
If you roll into the 20th, like to the early 20th century, and there's lots more tourists, they're starting to talk about the protection of, say, like bird life and turtles, really visible parts of the GBR, because people weren't able to get underwater per se. So they're starting to protect small cays, like Michaelmas Cay, Oyster Reef, where lots of birds would roost. They would protect particular species of birds.
Yep.
They would protect turtles. So by about the 1950s, a lot of the islands of the GBR were essentially wildlife sanctuaries. People weren't allowed to kill birds, kill turtles. There were prohibitions on the collection of shells. People still took shells. You could buy them illegally. People were selling them illegally in tourist shops as well. But these were the earliest attempts to protect the GBR. But one of the issues here was that people, whilst they would talk about the GBR as a large environment, they weren't really thinking about the GBR as an entire park that could be protected, like how we see it today. So in about the 1960s, that's when you start to see this shift, and it comes along with, a shift in environmental politics globally. Yeah. People often speak about Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. So really, that was a game changer. Images of the Earth that were coming from space travel really changed the way people thought about like the Earth as a system, and you can start to see that infiltrating the way that people think about the GBR as a large system that needs to be protected by large scale, widespread economic development.
Yeah,
So that was starting to happen in about the early 1960s.
And as I said, people probably wouldn't be aware of these early conservation efforts, people other than yourself who have a deep interest in the history of how it all started. Can we move to, say, the 1950s, 1960s, when this push to protect the GBR really started to gather momentum? So specifically, what happened and who were some of the key players that really pushed all this?
Yeah, so after the Second World War, there was an interest in developing Northern Australia. And the reef comes into that story because, as many people might know, the United States had a significant military occupation in Northern Australia. And they were seeking to take advantage of the awareness these travelling US military folks had of the GBR, taking it back over the United States to draw in international travellers.
Yep.
One of the things that they realised was that the tourist conditions on the GBR at this time were pretty spartan, like they were poor. Back then it was really, really tough.
Yeah.
So there was a really keen interest to develop the tourist infrastructure of North Queensland. So that was one thing that started to spark concern.
What do you mean by that? Is it terms of boats to get out onto the reef, pontoons, etc.?
Yeah, airports, boats, port development, large scale development of like the islands and things like that, just to make them more sort of luxury, sort of I guess like late 20th century sort of luxury.
Yeah.
So that was one concern, like what's this going to do in terms of pollution? That was definitely a big concern. The second one was, and you alluded to it at the beginning, there was also this interest in, making Australia more self-sustainable in terms of its petroleum reserves. Okay, and in the background, the states of Australia and the Commonwealth of Australia were trying to come up with an agreement, a legislative agreement that would allow sort of cooperation, like between the different levels of governments, to access offshore oil reserves.
Yeah.
For Queensland, the GBR is pretty much the entirety of our offshore sort of area.
Yep.
In the 1950s, you started to see petroleum companies engaging reef geologists, so folks who are really interested in the geology of the reef, engaging them in a sort of consultancy sort of point of view about locating potential oil reserves on the GBR. So in that period, I know of at least two, sort of surveys of the GBR. There's a number of drillings that occurred as well.
Yep. So these weren't just proposals, they actually sunk drills on the reef.
Yeah, 100%. And there had been some drilling that had occurred in the 1920s or 30s that were done to basically answer like reef geology questions, so the formation of reefs, for example.
Yep.
But these were explicitly paid for by petroleum companies to reef geologists to locate oil reserves. Now, they couldn't really find any, but the question still remained, there's likely to be oil on the reef. There was also, so that was another development that was starting to bubble away.
Yep.
And the third one was this interest in, as you mentioned, lime for all sorts of things. You mentioned farming, but it was also cement manufacturing.
Yeah, okay.
So in Moreton Bay, for example, in Brisbane, there was a cement manufacturer that was actually using the coral of Moreton Bay in their cement manufacturing.
Yeah. And back then, was that unregulated? Could they take it, I guess, as much as they wanted?
It was regulated, and it was just part of the way things were done. I mean, there was lots of use of coral lime all up and down the North Queensland and Queensland coast because it was so abundantly available. So, for example, the township of Cardwell, it's a flat sort of, at low tide, I imagine they could just walk out and grab some of the coral that was there, and they use that to build sort of government houses. There's a beacon on Rain Island that's almost entirely built out of coral.
Wow.
The first research station on Heron Islands was built out of coral rock, and just yesterday I was handling a coral rock from Magnetic Island. So it was a really common practice, and it was just operated under typical regulation of mining, so through the state government, mining leases and things like that. Sometimes it was used for the manufacturing of cement, other times it was lime. But in the 1950s, there was a definite interest in widespread development of this, and quite openly too. But in the 1960s, however, you start to see the development of things like the Wildlife Preservation Society of Queensland, so these conservation groups, the Australian Conservation Foundation, and one that was particularly important for the the protection or the eventual protection of the GBR was it was called the Queensland Littoral Society. Now it's called the Australian Conservation and Marine Science Society or something like that. They changed their name. It was Queensland Littoral Society. When they became aware of these developments, that's when everything changed.
Yeah. So who were some of the key figures or key voices in this movement, following awareness of these practices?
One of the most prominent figures in the Wildlife Preservation Society was its Queensland president, which at the time was the Australian poet and public intellectual Judith Wright. She subsequently published a book about this whole period called The Coral Battleground, which is really, I couldn't have done my work without, they often say historians sort of stand on the shoulders of giants. She's the giant that I stood on.
Yep.
So she was a major figure. In the 1960s, she had already published some of her most significant poetry. She was a major public figure, and she definitely was a key figure within this sort of fight. Another major or prominent individual was one of the figures that was important in the establishment of the Queensland Littoral Society, a man called Eddie Hegel.
Yep.
And then two others were Len Webb, who was a scientist with CSIRO. And then another figure was a man called John Boost, who was an interesting figure, and there's a biography has just come out by another reef historian. There are a couple of us. Ian McCalman wrote a really moving biography of a man called John Boost, who resided up in Bengal Bay near Mission Beach.
Yeah, okay. So there are a few, I guess, fairly prominent people and some, as you said, more behind the scenes. But for something like this to gather traction and gain momentum, it really takes public appetite for change as well. So once this came to prominence, it was really, I guess, reef lovers from Queensland, Australia, all around the world that helped push this forward.
When it became clear that they were going to drill the reef, initially there was the fear that they were going to allow a person to mine a particular reef off Mission Beach called Ellison Reef. Now, as I mentioned, this had happened a number of times through the history of the GBR, but at this time the appetite for this type of thing had totally changed, right? And the man I alluded to, John Boost, he became aware of an attempt to mine this reef, Ellison Reef, which is just off Mission Beach, which is near where he lived. And like Ellison Reef, it's not if you passed over it in a boat, you wouldn't know you passed over it.
Yeah.
As in, there's nothing significant about this reef. It was just accessible to a particular cane farmer who wanted to use it for lime. Boost was a really well-connected individual. He went to school with Harold Holt, and at this time, Harold Holt was the Prime Minister of Australia.
Yep.
So he made contact with his friend. Boost was already part of the Wildlife Preservation Society of Queensland, so he also made contact with Judith Wright.
Yep.
And he was also friends with Len Webb, this CSIRO ecologist. And so basically from Bengal Bay, he's just a ferocious letter writing campaign to public figures, business people all over the place. And by this time there was it's important, the GBR had already become a really important part about how Australians see themselves. It's interesting to think that an environment can be so important in the identity of a nation.
Yeah.
But that's clearly what he tapped into, this idea that, we don't want to see the reef turned into a mine for oil, and we certainly don't want to see it become a mine full stop. So he really tapped into that, and it started to demonstrate that, yes, in the past there had been this appetite or this idea that we could mine this place for lime and potentially petroleum, but he demonstrated, and so did Judith Wright and all these other figures, that across the country and across the world, people had started to see the GBR as something that is special and unique, that should be protected from these particular forms of exploitation.
Yeah.
It was fascinating to see that play out.
How fortunate is it that someone like Boost, who, when you read his biography, it starts off that he was perhaps a bit of a bohemian from down in Melbourne, that he was incredibly well connected. Was it just a stroke of luck? Would the creation of the marine park followed the same course that we know today if someone like Boost hadn't been involved?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to play these type of like these games, but I think like the curiosity you're tapping into is the stuff that sort of drives me. You know, like this idea that these things, like the establishment of marine park authorities, the protection of particular environments, or even our attitude to a particular environment, they don't just happen. Like often people take them for granted. You know, in understanding Boost's life, for example, alongside the history of the GBR, you can actually start to see that there's lots, it's like a really complex story that you can't take those things for granted. They're important. And you got to lean into those complexities. You can't just sort of like take them out necessarily. But he was definitely a really prominent figure. He died in 1971, if memory serves me correctly. So he never actually got to see the marine park protected.
Yeah.
But he was certainly one of the most important figures in its saving, I would say.
You've mentioned in your book, Saving the Reef, that you call it very much a human story, and you've sort of touched on it there. Was there a moment in your research when you were doing your PhD or when you were writing your book, etc., that really perhaps moved you personally or really amazed you or anything like that?
I don't know. Maybe it's my North Queensland upbringing, but I don't get moved too easily. But I think there were moments where I found it, you know, like I was shocked.
Yeah.
You know, like the way that people would talk about the reef or things that were being done to the reef, or some moments where I thought, oh, I can't believe I've actually found this. You know, there was one of the big figures in this entire thing was Joe Bjelke-Petersen, who had just started his premiership, or his long stint as premier in 1968. So he was at his weakest politically when this was happening, the Save the Reef campaign. I've always come to know Joe Bjelke-Petersen as this sort of strong, ruthless figure, and he certainly was. And you know, but in what I found interesting is seeing him in real moments of weakness. I found that really interesting.
Yeah.
I think the thing that always moves me is the intense, like earnest intensity that people feel about the GBR.
Yeah.
Even people who have never really seen it. And I've only seen very small portions of it, but I've always been moved by the way that people hold this place dear, even if they've never seen it. They might have in the 1940s only ever read about it.
Yeah.
In the 1960s, they might have only seen pictures and heard stories of travellers that have gone there. But I guess I'm moved by that, and I find that very curious too.
So further to that, Rohan, can you step us through the actual process, if you like? So the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act received royal assent in June 1975. What were the steps leading up to that, and then how did that, progress in the early years?
Yeah, so you have, in 1967, you have this threat to mine Ellison Reef, and that's sort of its own separate skirmish happening basically in the Mining Warden's Court of Innisfail up and through 1968, and that sort of stops. And basically at that point, the Mining Warden Court says, look, my recommendation is that you aren't allowed to mine Ellison Reef, but it still sits with the Queensland government. So it's sort of a recommendation to the Minister for Mines. At this stage was a man named Ron Cam. Now, Ron Cam's the Minister for Mines. He's sitting with this decision. So in 1968 as well, basically the leaseholds of the GBR, so the petroleum leaseholds where people can lease areas to drill the reef for oil, is also publicly released. It becomes clear because the legislation I refer to, this cooperative legislation, is passed.
Yep.
So then this skirmish on Ellison Reef and the sort of resources that have been mobilised around that turns towards protecting the reef from oil mining through 1968 and through to 1970, basically. And in that period of time, you have all sorts of different skirmishes or different sort of disputes around all sorts of things. You know, how we deal with COTS, relationships between different scientific bodies like the Great Barrier Reef Committee and the Australian Conservation Foundation and Queensland Littoral Society and the Wildlife Preservation Society. They're all fighting amongst themselves. The Queensland government's trying to sort of build enough political will to drill the place for oil. And then you have the black ban in early 1970, right? It forces both governments, the federal government and the Queensland government, to figure this out. And the mechanism that they use to sort of sort out how we're going to do this is through a royal commission, a sort of joint royal commission. And it was basically a royal commission to answer basically 5 questions. Should we drill the reef for oil? If so, where? What could we gain if we do? What could we lose if we do? And I can't remember the 5th one, but it was a really narrow sort of terms of references. Anyway, that Royal Commission begins in 1970 and it lasts pretty much, it doesn't hand down its reports until 1974. So by that stage, we've had a change of federal government. John Gorton's been moved on, William McMahon's been shoved out by the electorate. Basically, this decision around what we're going to do with the GBR is in courtrooms, and it goes for ages. There's lots of transcripts, lots of evidence. There's like 479 exhibits, like 40,000 pages. It's a monster.
Wow. Yep.
And one of the exhibits that was presented was an actual piece of legislation written by a person called Patricia Mather, who at that time was the president, and she had been the secretary, and she was a marine scientist of the Great Barrier Reef Committee, which was this arm of the Royal Society of Queensland, been in existence since the 1920s. It was probably one of the most prominent reef bodies. It was the most prominent reef body, basically. Anyway, as this president, she presents to the Royal Commission this piece of legislation, basically a draft act or a draft bill of a marine park that could protect or manage the GBR and still allow like some exploitation, say through fisheries and tourism or whatever. It didn't necessarily rule out oil exploitation, but it basically said like if it competes with other values, then it can't occur.
Yeah, okay.
And it was a really interesting moment because we have this scientist who gets asked by the chairman of the Royal Commission, do you have a background in law? She says no. Yeah. He's like, well, this is really impressive, and he basically promotes it in the report, saying like this is a sort of model essentially that we could use for the creation of a marine park. And so that gets handed down, these reports, in 1974, and as I mentioned, Gough Whitlam by this time, he's the Prime Minister. And he basically takes it and rubs off Patricia Mather's name essentially, and presents it as this bill, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, or the Act. Now, the key thing with this is that it basically is the federal government taking control over the GBR. Yeah. Now, I mentioned that this was an issue. It wasn't clear whether or not the Commonwealth government could legally do this. Yeah, okay. And the Queensland government certainly thought that they couldn't. And Bjelke-Petersen really didn't like Canberra, particularly didn't like Gough Whitlam. Yep. So he took him to court, to the High Court, basically to say that it's trespassing against state rights. But at about the same time that Gough Whitlam was dismissed by the Governor-General and then dismissed by the electorate in favour of the federal government actually saying like, you do have the right to do this. The GBR doesn't belong to the state of Queensland, it belongs to the federal government, so they can definitely have this marine park authority. And then after 1975, under the Prime Ministership of Malcolm Fraser, who was actually the Minister of Environment during the most of the Save the Reef campaign, that's when you start to see the establishment of the sort of marine park itself. But I should mention that even after that period of time, in 1975, there was still a fear, particularly amongst the conservationists who've been part of it, like, for example, Judith Wright, that the marine park could be drilled for oil, because by this stage, Joh Bjelke-Petersen was much more powerful. He was really entrenched now as Premier. Yep. And there was this fear that he would just do whatever he liked. And I've seen her in her archival material writing letters saying this, expressing this concern. And she's also at this time putting together the Coral Battleground, her book, which is based on her memories and diaries from that period of time. And so it comes out in 1977, with that picture of an oil rig on the GBR.
Yeah.
And, like you say, striking image. It's hard to think about it. Like, well, she put it on the front cover, and it came out in 1977. But, I think Malcolm Fraser, who was the Prime Minister at this time, like Harold Holt, like John Gorton, like Gough Whitlam, I can't speak for William Gorton, but these federal leaders, they had explicitly said and privately said that they don't want to see the GBR developed.
Yeah.
So it was in more or less developed for oil, petroleum, and lime. So it was in safe hands, but nonetheless, that fear still remained. And by 1981, when it was listed under World Heritage Act, it was sort of rest assured that should not happen. Time is it throws up all sorts of curiosities.
Yes, it's such a fascinating story. It really is. And as I said, from a Reef Authority point of view, we're celebrating more significant milestones this year. It's last year it was 20 years of marine park zoning, which was another significant movement for protection of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. It's 20 years of our traditional use of marine resource agreements this year as well. But can I ask you, as I said, it seems almost unbelievable. How close did we come to seeing oil drilling on the Great Barrier Reef?
Yeah, it's hard to measure it in like distance or time, but yeah, really, really close. So yeah, in the end of 1969, it was definitely going to happen. The companies AMPOL and JPEX were bringing from the United States an oil rig to a place called Repulse Bay, which is down near Mackay. It's essentially a little bay that basically the Queensland government said we can mine here no matter what, because it was considered to be internal waters. So if you can imagine, like, it's a bay like that, anything inside of that was considered internal waters. They were going to chuck a oil rig right there.
Yeah.
So John Booster's writing letters on New Year's Eve of 1969 to Gough Whitlam, to the John Gorton, say, you've got to help me here. To his lawyers as well. You could see in his letter angst that this is going to happen.
Yeah.
He and the leader of the Queensland Littoral Society, Eddie Hegel, they had been lobbying trade unions as well. It's like they were going all over the place in terms of the political landscape. They lobbied the trade unions. And in early 1970, the trade unions, it was basically announced by a senator called George Georges, and the trade unions for engineers basically said, it's a black ban. Any oil rig that comes here, we're not going to work on. There was a threat that any accommodation that these folks might be staying in would also be part of the boycott. And that basically put an end to it, but we came extremely close. Extremely close.
Yeah, and it's almost unbelievable to think, isn't it? It's such a fascinating story, particularly for those of us, I guess, on the outside looking into the nuts and bolts of how it all came together. Could I ask you, what advice would you give, I guess, as someone who knows almost the complete history of how the marine park was formed or is very much an expert in it, what advice would you give to the next generation, I guess, that are looking to help protect the reef? How can you affect meaningful sort of social change like we've seen?
Yeah, I mean, the part of that story that I guess moves me or gives me pause is how much they imagine that the GBR, it wasn't just about protecting an environment necessarily, but it was really about protecting how we engage with this environment is one thing, but also protecting a particular set of values. And I think that's really important when we think about management of any environment, that there's always going to be a number of values that are associated with that. Marine or environmental protection is essentially a human thing, right? We're protecting it from ourselves for ourselves. And so what is it about ourselves that requires this environment? And why do we want this environment? And I think that's a really important part to remember, that the GBR Marine Park was about maintaining in existence this environment so that people could use it forever.
Yep.
Under a number of different shifting values. So it's about understanding why we want it, and what we want it for. And I think that's really important to remember.
Yeah. So unpacking that a little bit further, I guess, from your perspective, Rohan, from your research and looking into these, all the historical aspects of how this campaign came to be, what's been the biggest change, I guess, in terms of people's perceptions of the reef?
I'd say the biggest change is probably the emergence of and the importance people place on bringing in traditional owner attitudes and values, and the acknowledgement of the GBR as basically unceded First Nations country. That's been by far the biggest change in the way people see the reef.
It's a really interesting point, I guess, particularly, say, from a Reef Authority perspective, 50 years since the formation of the marine park, all of our management practices is underpinned with traditional knowledge, and we have traditional owner reference groups and traditional use of marine park resources agreements. So it's really sort of, again, changed the nature of marine park management here in Australia, but probably around the world as well.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, one of the things that fascinates me about the history of the environment is the way that our shifting attitudes and shifting politics and social beliefs or values, how that then also translates into how we interact with our environments. And the shift towards acknowledging First Nations people of Australia, that has. That's really important. That's a really foundational way around how Australians see their environment today, and that's something that has developed, in my opinion, particularly with the GBR over the last 50 years.
I don't know, from a personal point of view, we're preparing to celebrate, as I said, 20 years of our TUMRA agreements, traditional use of marine resources agreements, right up and down the GBR catchment, and there's more and more traditional owner groups expressing interest or coming on board with that and wanting to know how we can all work together. And it's really important, not only from a conservation perspective, but from a management perspective moving forward to protect the reef for the next generation.
Yeah, I 100% agree, yeah.
Look, it's such a fascinating story. It really is, once you start to dig down into how it all came about. And it just shows, I guess, that reef protection and reef management really isn't just about science. It's about people and passion, and how the reef is a very important part of our cultural identity here in Australia. And it's really heartening to see, I guess, that 50 years later, that spirit and that passion is still very much alive and well. So we really appreciate your time, mate, and hopefully we chat to you again soon.
No, it's thrilled to be here. Thank you.